Hi, welcome back. This is Dr. Burton, and after a little break, we're going to continue our discussion of Dr. Gangadean's Philosophical Foundation, a critical analysis of basic beliefs. Last time we covered chapter 3. We are now in chapter 4 on eternality and causality. I'm just going to read through it and we'll talk about it. This is where he gives the argument there must be something eternal. We're moving from epistemology, which asks the question, how do we know, to metaphysics, what is real? In the last chapter, we talked about our most basic concept is about eternal being. And so now we're going to ask, what is eternal? Must something be eternal? We will begin to analyze basic beliefs for meaning. Before looking at various answers to the question, what is eternal, we must ask, must there be something eternal? The answer to this will begin to show how basic things are clear to reason. Remember the opening sentences. Some things are clear, the basic things are clear, the basic things are about God and man and good and evil are clear to reason. So he's going to start showing what's clear to reason. The following is offered as proof that there must be something eternal. Also, remember we talked about knowledge is by argument, reason and argument, and proof. And this is going to be argument by reductio ad absurdum. Contradictory statements cannot both be true and cannot both be false at the same time and in the same respect by the laws of thought. 2. The contradiction of some is eternal is none is eternal. So remember the square of opposition. 3. If none is eternal, then all is temporal, all had a being, all is temporal, all had a beginning, all came into being. Okay? That's because if everything is temporal, then that means temporal means it had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, then it came into being. 4. If all came into being, then being came into existence from non-being. 5. Being from non-being is not possible. 6. Therefore, the original, none is eternal, is not possible. And 7. Therefore, its contradiction, some is eternal, must be true. Now, if you have questions about that, I want you to go back, read each sentence carefully, and think about it. And there is a square of opposition on this page to help you. So we have none is eternal in the top. And the diagonal, some is eternal. Here, I'll put my finger on it. Some is eternal. Both can't be true. Both can't be false. You can review those, the chapter 3 where we discuss the square of opposition. None is eternal applies to all being whatsoever. It applies to particular beings as well as the substance out of which being is formed. It applies to material being as well as to non-material being, spirit, to visible being as well as invisible being. It applies against an infinite series of momentary beings. Atoms do not create other atoms ex nihilo, nor does a temporal spirit have the power to create other spirits or atoms ex nihilo. Being comes from being alone. Non-being is the absence of being and of the power to cause to be. Okay, so think about that before you come up with all your objections. If being could come from non-being, then there would be no distinction between being and non-being. A could then be non-A. If being could come from non-being, then there could be uncaused events. There would be no way to distinguish a caused from an uncaused event. When basic distinctions collapse, all distinctions resting on them become meaningless. It is clear, therefore, through the use of reason, that something must be eternal. For a skeptic, to doubt this is to give up reason. To give up reason is to give up meaning. There must be something eternal is maximally clear, since the opposite is not logically possible. If it is not clear to reason that being cannot come from non-being, then nothing can be clear. To assert being from non-being at the micro level in quantum physics or at the macro level in an inflationary theory of the origin of the universe is to give up reason. To assert uncaused events in support of contra-causal freedom is to give up reason. To assert some is eternal is to deny at least some interpretations of the first noble truths of Buddhism, that all is dukkha, impermanent, lacking, self-existence dependently co-arising. It is to deny at least some interpretations of Heraclitus, that all is fire or flux or becoming or change, without any permanence whatsoever. A closer and somewhat extended look at causality and uncaused events is appropriate here in light of objections which might be raised against this first and most basic argument to show there must be something eternal. If there is agreement on what is more basic, there can be agreement on what is less basic. So I don't know if you noticed it or not, but he just gave objections to several forms of Buddhism and to Heraclitus and his flux theory, which would also include Nietzsche's flux theory. So he kind of just knocked out a few possible, logically possible worldviews with a few paragraphs. I love that, don't you? All right, so let's talk about on causality and uncaused events. The argument against nothing is eternal is a reductio ad absurdum argument. That is to say, it is absurd or rationally unintelligible to think being came into existence from non-being. To assert being from non-being is to assert uncaused events. Some analysis may help clarify matters further. The epistemological status of belief in causality. This is going to be great. Belief in causality is not an empirical claim. Causality, or its absence, cannot be known by observation. There is not any indicator, and there can be no indicator of causality or the lack of causality. Belief in causality is transcendental. It is a necessary condition for the intelligibility of the world and thought. So if you don't have causality, you can't have thought, and you can't have an intelligible world. He gives some arguments here. 1. If there can be one uncaused event, there can be more than one uncaused event. Any or many or all events may be uncaused. There is no non-arbitrary rational way to limit the number of uncaused events. 2. If one uncaused event is logically possible, then all events can be uncaused, and then nothing would be logically impossible. 3. If uncaused events were possible, it would be possible for there to be no causal connections whatsoever between a thought or a sense impression and the cause in either the external world or in my mind. There could be no causal connection between what one person said and what the other person heard, or between one thought and another, premise and conclusion, in anyone's mind, or between intention and act in any person. As a matter of integrity, belief in causality is a necessary condition for belief in thinking and for dialogue. So if we don't believe in causality, we can't have a conversation. Next, being from non-being and uncaused events. 1. Being from non-being is not creation ex nihilo. In creation ex nihilo, God exists eternally, in contrast to nothing is eternal, and God acts to bring the world into existence. The world coming into existence by a divine act of creation is not an uncaused event. 2. So God is a being and God causes other beings. 2. Being from non-being is not coming into existence by an unknown or unknowable cause, as in quantum physics. An unknown or unknowable cause is still a cause. It is not non-being. 3. Being from non-being is not causation by an invisible being, material or spiritual. Appeal to a singularity to explain the origin of the universe is not an uncaused event, since there are no uncaused events. 4. An uncaused event is not the same as an uncaused being. An uncaused being is an eternal being. An event is not a being. So God is an uncaused being, but there are no uncaused events, happenings, things that are caused. 5. Being from non-being is like an atom or a subatomic particle or a person coming into existence from absolute non-being without any cause whatsoever. 6. Being from non-being is not to be understood as being caused to be by nothing or non-being as the cause. Nothing or non-being is not a cause. Caused by nothing is equivalent, by observation, to not caused by anything. Not caused by anything is an uncaused event. Next section. Is being from non-being a contradiction? 1. Being from non-being is said to be like A from non-A. Since A from non-A is not a contradiction, like matter from spirit or a chicken from an egg, then being from non-being is not a contradiction. Response. Being from non-being is not like A from non-A. Non-A is still a category of being, not non-being. Being from non-being is like A from either A or non-A, if A and non-A can be considered to encompass all categories of being. It would be like matter from neither matter nor spirit, or a chicken from neither chicken nor egg. 2. Since being from non-being is not a contradiction like the square circle, it is said to be not a contradiction, even if it is thought to be false and unbelievable. Response. Being from non-being is not a formal contradiction stated in this form, but it implies a formal contradiction. If being from non-being were possibly true, then being would be no different from non-being. If being is no different from non-being, then being is non-being, which is a contradiction. It violates the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. Something is both A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. All right, so I'll let you read through those and think it through before you raise any objections. Next section. Is being from non-being clearly false, or does it require proof by what is more basic? Does this proof depend on the principle of sufficient reason, PSR, that there is a sufficient reason for everything that comes to pass? 1. There is more than one form of the PSR, which form might be appealed to as more basic. Then there's a footnote about the principle of sufficient reason. 2. Is the PSR any different in meaning from uncaused events or no being from non-being? 3. Is there any persuasive difference between the two? Would those who affirm uncaused events be more likely to affirm PSR? Okay, so you're wondering, what is all this about? All of this is about actual objections that have come up in the course of discussion in the classroom, in public lectures, written, people Dr. Gangadean has talked to. So these have been real objections he has faced. And you may too. So this is giving you ammunition ahead of time before you face the people who want to argue that being can come from non-being. Okay, permanence, change, and causality. The classic metaphysical antinomy between change, all is flux, change, dukkha, and permanence, the world of plurality and change, is an illusion, maya, unreal, either affirms uncaused events or denies change and causality altogether. If there is no permanence of being continuing from one moment to another, then each moment of being is wholly independent in arising and does not and cannot dependently co-arise. Momentariness, over and against any possible form of permanence, is a mere succession of being from non-being. If one instance of being from non-being is unintelligible, an infinite series of being from non-being would be infinitely unintelligible. On the other hand, denying all causality by denying all change will be seen to be equally unintelligible. So he's addressing the classic problem in philosophy of permanence and change. All is change, Heraclitus, all is permanence, Parmenides. That also comes out in Buddhism, all is flux, and some forms of Hinduism, all is permanence, all is one. Is freedom incompatible with causality? The classic antinomy between freedom and determinism rests on an incompatibilist notion of freedom in relation to causality. Since ought implies can, the ability to do otherwise, and an effect necessarily follows from a cause, it could not be otherwise, causality is often denied in order to preserve freedom. Immanuel Kant did this, William James did this. Libertarians affirm uncaused events in order to preserve moral intelligibility in the universe. But moral intelligibility cannot be sealed off from the loss of metaphysical intelligibility through uncaused events. If there are uncaused events, for example, an act can be uncaused by an intention to act or not to act. On the other hand, if can implies want, I can use my reason if I want to. Then freedom, defined as doing what I want, is not incompatible with causation. The choice here is not between determinism, all events are caused, and indeterminism, some events are uncaused, but between an intelligible and ultimately unintelligible definition of freedom. Skepticism and causality. Fully consistent skepticism, held by Sextus Empiricus, must ground itself in the logical possibility of an uncaused event. If all things are possible, and if every view is equally opposed to its contradiction, then all came into being from non-being would be possible, and nothing came into being from non-being would be equally as possible as something came into being from non-being. That is, by an uncaused event. But to allow the logical possibility of uncaused events is to allow the possibility that A is non-A, which denies reason and the intelligibility of all thought. If all views are possible, then equally no view is possible. This is the end of all views and is not itself a view. The alternative to all views are possible is that all logically possible views are ontologically possible. That means all the views that we look at on the square of opposition are possible views of being, but it may be that in the end they turn out to be meaningless. This alternative does not add much to our understanding, but it does invite us to explore which views are logically possible. The argument to show there must be something eternal is about our most basic belief. To avoid it, one must avoid the distinction between being and non-being, between temporal and eternal. Everyone who professes to make meaningful statements can and should be asked to respond to this argument or to show how any of their other utterances can be meaningful without making these distinctions. This argument is the cornerstone belief of any worldview. If we cannot know this, we cannot know anything else. It would be futile to go any further in discussion without agreement on this basic belief. We are therefore not obliged to consider the views of anyone who neglects or avoids this argument. On the other hand, if we know by reason and argument that there must be something eternal, we can agree on much more. Basic things are clear. If we agree on what is more basic, we can agree on what is less basic. To assert some is eternal does not prove that this some is God. It means at least some is eternal, not only some is eternal. That's an important distinction. Perhaps all is eternal. Further argument would be needed to show that only some is eternal. In the argument to show some is eternal, we have used a reductio argument. We have also used a form of the ontological argument, which argues that what cannot be conceived cannot exist. An eternal being is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Since there must be something eternal, an eternal being is also a being which necessarily exists, a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. To say at least some is eternal does not mean only one is eternal. Whether it is possible for there to be more than one being that is eternal will be examined later. This is prior to considering whether a second eternal being must necessarily exist or only one must necessarily exist. It is not being argued that having existence as a predicate is to be greater than what lacks that predicate. So we're going to have to deal with the problem of dualism, that two things are eternal. It is not being argued that we know something exists by reason. That something exists is not being argued for, since it is common ground. Who doubts that something is? No one has ventured past solipsism, which is the view that only I exist. It would be self-refuting to say nothing exists. To assert an eternal being must exist is to assert the greatest possible being must exist. Nothing, temporal, is as great as or greater than an eternal being. And there would be no way to say one eternal being is greater than or better than another eternal being. By aiming at less with this form of the ontological argument, we can avoid many of the historical objections raised against Anselm's version. And then there's a footnote here to the discussion about St. Anselm's ontological argument. So what have we done in this chapter? First, we argued that there must be something eternal, and we did that by saying the contradiction, nothing is eternal, means that all is temporal, all had a being, all came into being, which would mean all came into being from non-being. That's a contradiction. That's not possible logically or ontologically. Therefore, something must be eternal. And then we talked about what does it mean to say no being from non-being. And then finally, we said that this is a form of the ontological argument. It revises the classical ontological argument by Anselm and claims less. So the next video will talk about part 2 of the book, which is metaphysics. So chapter 5 is material monism, and we will look at some objections that have been raised in our YouTube channel in the comment section as we go through those. So thank you for joining me through this conversation. Next time, chapter 5. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Have a great day.